I'm Nicola Robson and I'm an Early Years Outreach Advisor for SEND Success at Whitefields. Today we are going to talk about effective transitions for children with special educational needs and disabilities in the early years. So to begin with, we need to think about the importance of transitions for children with special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND. So children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND, often find transition more challenging than their peers. This is a quote from NASEN, the National Association for Special Educational Needs. They have devised a transition guide, which I will give you a link to at the end of this presentation. It's a really useful document. It doesn't have a great deal of early years specific information, but it has a lot of informative content. The Equality Act 2010 places a duty on settings to make reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustments are something that we've all heard of before and most certainly encompasses transition. NASEN described this duty as anticipatory, meaning we shouldn't wait for the child to arrive to start making the adjustment, but to be prepared and remove barriers where possible before the child arrives. The Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Code of Practice 2015 also specifies the importance of transition in early years, stating support should include planning and preparation for transition before a child moves into another setting or school. This can also include a review of the SEN support being provided or the EHC plan. To support the transition, information should be shared by the current setting with the receiving setting or school. Current setting should agree with parents the information to be shared as part of this planning process. So really all of these things that we've identified or that we've looked at not only identify that children with special educational needs are likely to find transition challenging, but that this should be planned and prepared in advance of the child arriving at the new setting. This is very much considered reasonable adjustment, anticipating what they might need and trying to remove those barriers before they get there. So we talk a lot about transition, but I can't really stress enough how important it is. We have a legal duty to do this and to do it as effectively as possible. So transition, let's look at that more specifically, or maybe more generally is perhaps the better term. So transition is something that we talk about a lot in early years, but it's something that can be quite difficult. Transition should be considered in two parts. So from the feeder setting or nursery and the receiving setting. There's a lot of crossover between what each side should do and between what is good practice for all children and good practice for children with SEND. There's some, by which I mean there's some really good practice to be had irrespective of need. Some of the strategies that we just do for all children are still good strategies for children with SEND. But along with the good practice comes some additional understanding and patience. We might need to tweak little things to make it more applicable for a child with SEND. So right now we're looking at transition from a PVI or a maintained nursery into a school reception. As I said, there's some crossover with what is good practice for all children and what is good practice for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And ideal scenarios would include regular visits, information sharing and preparation. Now, ideal transition packages are very difficult. I totally understand this. Often the biggest problem is manpower, because we need the staff for the most effective transitions and we often don't have that as much as we would like. If we look first at transition as a whole, what the child needs, then we can look at who should be doing what to best support this. This is fairly self-explanatory and it's relevant to all children really. What we really have to think about for special educational needs and disabilities is the information sharing and the possible difficulties around all of the above. So a good transition strategy is to have uniform ready in advance, so the child is familiar with it, so that they know that that's what they're going to be wearing. Perhaps if they're going to make visits to the new setting, they should wear it then. But things like that will need to be gauged according to the individual. Information sharing. So information sharing, the setting should make sure they are sending the relevant information onto the receiving setting before the child starts. Visits, meet the new teacher, tour the new environment, spend time in the new class and significant areas, and do several of these visits. So by significant areas, that might be the toilet area, or if the child has never stayed for lunch before and they're going to be staying now, make sure they're familiar with the dinner hall. Any new playgrounds, perhaps it's a nursery attached to a school. The child still might be unaware of new areas, so it's even more important that new areas are pointed out in that respect, because they may just consider their previous setting, the nursery on the same site. They won't differentiate very much, so things need to be pointed out. Prepare, have coat pegs, drawers, etc. labelled, including their picture, and label the environment. That's a really good strategy for all children, to label the environment. So make sure that the toilet is labelled and particular areas are labelled, and possibly pieces of equipment are labelled. Certainly boxes of toys and things labelled. You may wish to create a booklet featuring photos of the child and the new school. So we have here on this diagram social stories and booklets. You probably won't want to do both, and which one you use will depend on the level of understanding of your child. So a booklet featuring photos of the child and the new school for one group of students, and then the more academic children may benefit from social stories, which would be personal to the child. But if the child is not able to sit and listen to a story, a social story wouldn't be as effective for that child as a booklet would, featuring key photos and short sentences that you would read to them. Okay, so these are fairly general for all children, but specifically for SEND. So breaking it down then into feeder settings and receiving settings. First we'll look at the feeder setting. What should the feeder setting or the leaving setting do? They need to pave the way. So the feeder setting staff from that setting may wish to visit with the child. Perhaps parents visit with the child, but it's good if a staff member, certainly a key worker, visits with the child. The presence of their key worker might help the child feel more comfortable. Parents aren't necessarily the link that a child will need in an educational environment. Children are often different between home and school, so the key worker could be the link they need. If the nursery is on site with the reception class, you might be able to do more than one visit, which is ideal for special needs. As many visits in preparation as can be done should be done. Create a transition book for the child. This should be stage appropriate, as we discussed with the previous slide. The social story is not going to be as beneficial to a child who can't sit down and engage with the story, but a booklet would be good. And create a quick look profile for the new setting. So actually, let's go back to the create a booklet. Take photos of all the important points: the teacher, the classroom, toilet areas, the dinner hall, the playground, anything that you believe is important to that child. That might be different for individual children. Some children might not be bothered by a toilet, others this might make a really big difference. Make the booklet personal to them. Use text that is appropriate to them. If they're able to be in the pictures, that's fantastic. If they're able to take the pictures, even better. But it must be relevant and appropriate. So as I've said before, if the child understands stories, social story is good. And then create a quick look profile for the new setting. So There's a document that the borough have been using for a while, but it's recently been revamped, which I believe Holly Hutchins will be distributing and probably putting on the hub. So create a quick look profile. As I say, the borough have created a new document. Sharing information is key. Often what we hear is that too much information was passed on, so they weren't able to realistically make use of it, or that there wasn't enough, if anything at all, passed on. Now, for whatever reason that may be, I'm not here to examine why. It might have gone to the wrong people, but information seems to be a problem. So schools need to know what to expect in order for the best transition. The best thing is to send up a page with key information. What do I like? What do I dislike? How do I communicate? How do you communicate with me? What works well and what does not work well? Again, I refer to the new All About Me document that will be placed on the hub. There's a link at the bottom of this slide, which is for a transition booklet template from Send Success, which is downloadable. Receiving settings. So what should the receiving setting do? Well, you need to be prepared. That's the first thing. As we said right at the beginning, you have a duty to make reasonable adjustments in preparation for the child starting. So you need to remove barriers preemptively wherever possible. So do a home visit. Most schools do a home visit. This is fairly standard for reception classes for all children, irrespective of need. It would be really beneficial, if possible, to do a school visit. Seeing the child in their current education environment can be quite helpful. Also facilitate visits from the feeding nursery so that they can come up and see where they're going and help guide them through that, as we discussed with the previous slide. You can provide information at this point to go home with the child, what should be expected, what your school's policies are. Begin the relationship with the family. Provide photos of relevant things to facilitate a transition booklet. That's quite important as well, so that while we tell the feeding school that it's, or feeding setting, that it's important to make a booklet, it's important for the receiving setting to facilitate that. They will need photos. If they're not able to take them themselves, is this something that you can provide for them? Read the information that's been sent on. Look for the key information so that you can make transition as easy as possible. This can be quite overwhelming, we understand that. There can be lots and lots of information to try and wade through, so this is why there's the recommendation for the All About Me sheet, so that you can really pick up the key information as quickly as possible. These visits are really good to glean these kind of top tips from as well. So prepare necessities. Create a box of tricks. This might be things that have been advised, so the feeding setting may be telling you they really like bubbles, they really enjoy sensory toys, they like things that flash and sing and vibrate. Use all these things to create a box of tricks, your go-to box. If there's nothing that's been advised, if this is a new child coming in from no setting, having not previously been to a setting, create a multi-sensory box. So have something soft and fluffy, have something hard and vibrating, have something that flashes, have something that plays music and makes noise, have something to try. The important thing is to have a box of goodies to try and engage with the child. There will be times, or there could potentially be times, where you don't really know what else to do, so you've got something to go to, you've got something in your arsenal to bring out and say, let's have a try of this, let's see what we can find that motivates this child or interests this child. Label everything. Symbols are so important in communication difficulties and are useful to all children irrespective of needs. Having a visual timetable in place for the whole class will not hurt anyone. If it's a standard strategy in all classrooms irrespective of needs, when it is needed it is more natural, it flows, and other children are less aware of it, if you like. It's just something that's natural, a lot more organic, and it just moves with the class. All staff should wear key symbols on lanyards, as all staff are expected to work with a child, not just a one-to-one. If the child has a one-to-one, yes, the one-to-one should have a lanyard of symbols, but it's no good just one member of staff having it. Everyone in that room working with that child needs those symbols to communicate, otherwise the child learns they just communicate with the one person. Have these ready. Key symbols, you don't want hundreds of symbols on a lanyard that you have to spend half an hour flicking through to find the one you want. Have the key symbols. Stop, drink, toilet, things like that, things that you're going to use the most often. Have those on a lanyard ready to go. Label coat pegs and drawers and seats if required. They might not be used to sitting on a seat. So if there is a seat at a table that they are going to be expected to sit at, putting their picture on it probably isn't a bad idea. It helps the child understand expectation. Also label equipment and areas, as it's always useful to have a removable toilet symbol. I can't really stress that enough. If you have a child who is non-verbal, or who is toilet training, or is maybe verbal but very early stages, having a toilet symbol available can be really, really important. My advice is to have two copies of the symbol, laminate them both, attach one to the door, to your classroom door with Velcro, and then every time they need the toilet, whether you're taking them or whether they're requesting, have them remove the symbol and give it to you. It will start to make that link between requesting the toilet. And if they are non-verbal, then this is something that they can then start to look for to make their request known. Have snack symbols ready and prepared. We have relatively simple snacks. It's easy enough to get them all ready for use for when they first start. If all these things are there and ready, it helps to bridge that gap. There's less time for the queries. What am I going to do? What if they don't? Multi-agency working. So a commonality among feeder settings and receiving settings is the sharing of information. This will involve multi-agency working. So here we're going to look at all the potential multi-agencies that will be working with the one child. So these may or may not be people that you have involvement with, but it's important to know that they're around because they will impact on each other. So staff from both settings and parents need to share relevant information and appropriate information. There may also be input from other agencies involved. The child might have an EHC or an Education Health and Care Plan, which will involve the local authority, educational psychology, possibly speech therapy. The CDT, the Child Development Team at Wood Street, includes many pathways. The Joint Assessment Clinic for complex needs, visual impairment with developmental needs, Down syndrome pathway, neuromotor pathways, plus more individualised pathways. The professionals working in CDT, the Child Development Team, includes paediatricians, children's nurses, including epilepsy team, speech therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, play therapists and audiology. SAC is also part of CDT. So SAC is the Social and Communication Clinic at Wood Street. The SAC pathway is from the point of referral up to and post-diagnosis. Professionals in this clinic include specialist paediatricians, speech therapists and possibly an educational psychologist or portage teacher. So the local authority will almost certainly be involved. The SEN team are local authority employees also based at Wood Street. This team are responsible for education, health and care plans, SEN support including additional funding for reception and above. Each child with an education, health and care plan will have a named SEN officer. Portage workers sit in this team and support the early years SEND children at home. They provide transition documents as part of their discharge processes. Early years childcare and business development team are a local authority based team on Billet Road. They are responsible for SENIF, which is nursery children only. The area SENCOs sit in this team. They support the PVI sector. They have devised a transition project with Holly Hutchins, which will explain their role in the transition process. early help and social care teams sit in the local authority and will be able to provide information for SEND children also receiving their services. So knowing who is involved with the child is very important for accurate and up-to-date information. If the child doesn't have an education, health and care plan, you will need to know who has been involved in order to move forward with this. Ultimately, we're looking for the best possible outcome for the child, which means having accurate information and removing barriers to achievement. So that's a lot of information we've given you. Some of it you may be familiar with, some of it you may not be familiar with, but you need to be aware of it. You need to be aware of these agencies so that you can share the appropriate information with them and receive the appropriate information for the benefit of the child. So if we look back now to the transition, the general transition that we looked at the beginning, the strategies, let's look at the difficulties that we could face in achieving this, because nothing is necessarily smooth sailing. So we said we should get uniform ready in advance so the child's familiar with it, but there might be sensory issues linked to this. If you are a primary school that has a tie, this might be very difficult for children to wear. They could be very aware of the thing being around their neck, and it might be very difficult to get that on them. Wool jumpers might aggravate the skin. Lots of schools have got sweatshirts, but there are some that are wool. Maybe the child can't tolerate the wool. AirTech polo shirts might be too rough. The buttons might be a problem. Perhaps the child can't cope with the buttons around the neck. Shoes. Goodness me, shoes. Perhaps the child will only wear one pair of white trainers, but now they have to wear black shoes. These can be very real problems for children, and having it in advance doesn't mean they're going to be able to cope with it. So schools might need to think about how they deal with these. The reactions by the child with SEND might be sensory, not just a resistance to the change, and it's really important that we think about that. They might not be able to get over it, and it might be more than just I don't want to. It might be physically hurting them in some way that we are just not aware of. So perhaps you'll need to think about that. Now, though, some of those children you might know in advance coming up anyway, the particularly sensory needy children. But what is the school going to do? So where possible, nursery and family should share known problems, but these type of things might not have come up before. They might never have worn a tie before. If you can predict them, do so. You need to know what your reactions are going to be, and you need to consider, is it a necessary battle? Do you want to be arguing daily with a child that won't wear a tie? Perhaps they'll wear the rest of the uniform, but we can't get over the tie because of its tightness around the neck and how that feels. Perhaps the school can consider that in advance. So information sharing, as we've already said, can be a problem in respect of schools. Decisions have not necessarily been made, as in you might not know which class they're going to. So that can make creating booklets difficult. We advise, wherever possible, you make a booklet containing a photo of the new teacher and the new classroom and all the other things that go with that, but you might not find out the teacher until the week before the end of the summer term, which isn't as helpful as it could be to making things such as the booklets. So use what you have where you have it. If you know that reception classes tend to be fairly standard in that they're created specifically, so the reception class will always be in the same room. Take photos of the room, and then as soon as you know the teacher, get that photo. Too much information can be sent up. We've discussed this previously as well. So you could have a whole great big file sent up, but perhaps the one-page profile is all you really need, the All About Me document. So too much could be sent up, perhaps not enough is sent up, or maybe it's sent to the wrong place. We hear this a lot. The feeding setting is insistent they sent it up. The receiving setting is insistent they haven't got anything, but it's sitting in an office somewhere because it's made its way to the wrong person. These are not necessarily things in our control, but they're things that we can be mindful of. So look out for them in advance. Visits. similar to what we've said already, has the school decided classes? Can they visit the new class, or do we know when the new class is going to be? Do we know what teacher it is? It can be difficult to give the children the information that they need. The social stories, as we said, there's no point doing a social story if the child is not at the stage of understanding a story. Revert to your booklet and then prepare, knowing the needs of the pupil. This can be quite difficult because, especially if the child is not coming up from a setting, if they haven't been to a nursery before. Lots of children have, but if a child hasn't been to a setting, they're coming in as an unknown completely. There may be unexpected changes, so you may have got a teacher in mind and then the teacher leaves, or they're off long-term sick and so they're not there when the child is ready to start. We can't really account for things like that. We could have all resources in place but they still don't work, but the point is to have them in place. Here are a few links to some useful websites and some resources. This is a link to NACE and Transition Guide, which we discussed at the beginning. This is really good for transition in general, as well as some early years stuff. There's a link to the AET Transition Toolkit. There's also a link to some Whitefield resources, such as the downloadable booklet previously discussed. Also, don't forget to have a look on the Hub for the new All About Me document, which hadn't been released at the time of recording presentation. COVID-19. So it's important that we mention this really at this point because everything is very uncertain right now. During these times we do understand that various aspects of transition may be difficult to implement and you might therefore need to make adaptations. Some things might need to be deferred perhaps until September or whenever the children do return in line with government guidance. Please do feel free to contact us if there are any transition issues which we can support you with. And finally, here are our contact details. So I am Nicola Robson and I am an outreach advisor for Send Success at Whitefield. Zoe Wells is my colleague. One of us will be appointed to schools, but you may contact either one of us currently if you need support with anything, and especially if you need help with making transition adaptations perhaps. If you would like a copy of this presentation, please do email me and I will send this across to you.